had to really start thinking about where homophobia actually comes from, you know? So I did all this research and read a bunch of studies, and I found this one study that said that a lot of the roots of homophobia for certain people, it's jealousy, that we as queer people are able to subvert a lot of these societal expectations, like, you know, buying a house, having kids, getting married, and, you know, all of these steps that you're just assumed that you'll take, you know. So that was really literally the only way that I could understand homophobia, is because, like, yeah, I get if you're jealous, because being queer is the absolute best. So like, that's the only way that it made sense to me.
Hi, welcome back, Ivory Tower Boiler Room members. It is almost summertime, especially the way it's feeling right now on Long Island, and I'm sure how Mary's feeling in Jersey.
Oh,
So
yes.
I think it's about time for us to start digging into books that really speak to Pride Month. So without
Mhm.
further ado, Mary and I are so excited to be joined with Celia Laskey, who is the author of Under the Rainbow and the upcoming author. In a month, you all can buy her book. So Happy for You is her next book. So, Celia, it's been so wonderful chatting with you on Instagram, but to actually have you here, it's been a journey.
Yeah.
It's felt so far away, but we're already here,
Yeah. Well,
you
thank you
know?
so much for having me.
Yeah. So I was talking with Celia before we hit the record button about how exciting it's been teaching your novel. Once for a Whitman and his queer influence on other
Mm.
authors course with his idea of the multitude. And then
Hmm.
now I've taught it in relationship to the prom in my Broadway musical course. So
Wow.
yeah, I mean, just
Your
to
students
start,
are so lucky they're getting all this different stuff.
well, thank you. If you
And
want to
like
write
to put
another
me next
review for me, you can
and
write
like to
one of
put
my
me next
reviews.
to Whitman, that's wild.
Well, so I think just as a starting point, who did you turn to for inspiration when you were coming up with Under the Rainbow? Like, is there certain
Hmm.
media, film, TV, novels?
I would say that I looked to novels and stories as a genre, because that's always what I knew the book was going to be. It was sort of my workaround in that I only knew how to write short stories, but I also wanted to sell a book. So, what you generally do is you link the stories together, and then a publisher is hopefully willing to publish it. So yeah, I really looked at a lot of novels and stories. I would say that my Bible was probably Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. She is just, you know, one of my literary gods. I would like to just bow down and kiss her feet. So that book was very, very influential, um, with Under the Rainbow. Even the final story, like, they wanted me to rewrite and sort of make a final story that was more tying everything together, bringing characters back together. So that final story with Gabe 10 years later, is something that I wrote very late in the editing process. And I was like really lost about what I was going to do, how I was going to bring all these characters together. And then I went back and looked at Olive Kitteridge, and the final story had her falling in love. So I was like, well, that seems like a great idea. Maybe I'll do that for Gabe. Um, so yeah, that book was huge. Another one I used was In Other Rooms, Other Wonders. Have you ever read that book?
No, no, who wrote that?
It's um, I knew how to pronounce his name a while ago, but I'm sure I've forgotten at this point. It's Daniel Minuddin or something along those lines. He's a Pakistani writer, and the book is about a wealthy Pakistani landowner and all of the people who work for him on his property, and how they're sort of trying to, like, you know, climb up the ladder in certain different ways. It's a really fantastic book, but I I also taught it in one of my classes while I was in grad school, and my students had a very hard time absorbing everything in that book, because it's definitely a little bit harder to understand if you're not super familiar with like literary works, you know? And then probably the last one that I used was this book called The Imperfectionists by Tom Rackman. And that's about a group of people who work at an Italian newspaper. And so all of these books, you know, have different chapters from the different points of view of different characters. And, you know, I really just studied how they really weaved everything together. So it was very helpful to have, you know, those novels in existence.
Yeah. What's fascinating to me is none of them are LGBTQ plus in
Yeah.
theme. Like, is that something that's crossed your mind, or is it because you yourself have so much LGBTQ plus referential knowledge that you are already holding in your head, like the Wizard of Oz and being a friend of Dorothy and all of the allusions that come up in your novel?
Well, you know, at the time that I came up with the concept for this book and started writing it, um, queer lit was not really how it is right now. You know, like there still weren't a ton of queer books that were like super mainstream. So I don't know if there would have even been like a novel and stories that also featured queer characters that I could have used.
Mm.
I'm sure that I had like looked and probably couldn't find any. And you know, it's a really good thing to even wonder if right now, you know, in the years since I've published Under the Rainbow, if there are other, um, you know, books that fall into this categorization of novels and stories that are also like queer and trans. I would love to know that because I'm thinking of like everything I've read over the past couple years and nothing's coming to mind. Can you two think of anything?
Like where it blends novels and stories?
Yeah, where it's like novels and stories, but also featuring like queer and trans characters.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to think about it as we go. But if
Right?
something crosses my mind, I mean, we feature a lot of realist novels, but I wouldn't say that
Mm-hmm.
it's blending the vignette story element. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we've had um, PJ Vernon and Stephen Rowley's The Guncle,
Mm-hmm.
Josh Sabera, Nicholas D. Damasio's Burn It All Down. I'm trying to
Oh, you
think.
know which one might be kind of close is what was the number? Was it 100 Boyfriends by Brontes? I can't remember his last name. But it was a book that basically featured a lot of vignettes about all these different boyfriends that this character had. So that could probably be considered close.
Yeah, I would say like Michael Cunningham comes to my mind
Mm,
with what he does in The Hours.
mm.
Kind of has a
Mm-hmm.
vignette style. Um, but yeah, okay, well, we'll have to return to that. But I think it is so
I just looked it
fascinating.
up. It was
Oh,
it was 100 Boyfriends by
100
Brontes
boyfriends.
Purnell. If anyone
Okay.
wants to like know.
Okay, yeah, no, we definitely have to look into it. And I mean, Mary, like when you were reading Under the Rainbow, did The Wizard of Oz just keep coming up to you as an image and a
it
touchstone?
it did and it didn't because I didn't want the idea of the Wizard of Oz to cloud my perception of the novel. Like I didn't want to keep thinking, oh, where is like the tie between, the Wizard of Oz and Under the Rainbow? I kind of just wanted to let it naturally come up. But I definitely was like, I'm curious to see if this does come up. And I I'm gonna forget the character's name. I want to say it's Laurel Livingston, Irvingston. Um, she's the one with her son Dylan who had passed away in this novel,
Oh, Linda.
who who is
Linda.
revealed
Linda.
kind of is like, oh, so Big Bird is under the rainbow,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea of all of this is over the rainbow,
Mm-hmm.
then Big
Mm-hmm.
Bird is under. Um, which I really liked that. That just tied it so beautifully. And I felt like it was just such a perfect, simple explanation. Like you didn't need anything more. You're like, oh, yes, I get it. just because at that point in the novel, you understand so much about the setting and the town that these people live in and their ideologies, where, like I said, you don't need this long, lengthy explanation. It's literally a conversation between her and I think Jamal. And that's it. And then it's like, boom, that's it. And it was like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I mean, how did you come to that understanding, Celia, that Linda would be the character who like would deliver, would be talking with Jamal about the idea of your whole title? Like, did you always know that Linda would be the character who would think about the
No.
title? Oh, okay.
No, I think the title came after I had written all of the stories and we like pulled it out from that conversation. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool.
Because I don't think, I can't even remember. I think I was calling the book like Out of Water or something like that for a while, playing with the expression, like a fish out of water and you're in the middle of the country and there's no ocean, etc. But my dissertation advisor was the one who helped me come up with the title for the book. And I'm pretty sure that we pulled it from a story that I had already written. So yeah, that happens with titles a lot. You have to wait until you've written it and then there's a little phrase or something, that you can pull from.
Yeah. Well, and what did you get your PhD in?
I got my MFA.
Oh, your MFA. Okay.
Yeah, and I got it in creative writing with a focus on fiction. I got it at the University of Mexico, which is a tiny little program, but it's fully funded. So I was already in enough debt from undergrad that I didn't want to do that again. So it was a heavy teaching load, but I mean, I don't know if I could have written this book without having been in a program where that's like what I was working toward.
Yeah. And, are you still residing in the New Mexico area or where in the
No,
US are you?
I'm in LA now. So after that program, my wife and I, we had lived in New York for like a decade before we went to New Mexico for my program. And that was 3 years. And after that, we were like, well, we might as well just keep going west. So we moved to LA afterwards and we've been here for like 5 years now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any preference over New York or LA? Because that's the common
Yeah.
pitting them against each other.
I love LA as a place, especially like aesthetically. It's very, like, I love the hills, I love the palm trees, I love the weather. But it's true what they say about the people in LA. It's really a lot harder to find good people in LA. So I miss that about New York, but you really could not get me to move back to New York at this point in my life. I'm 37. I feel old as fuck. Are we allowed to swear?
Oh, yeah, you can curse.
Yes.
Yeah.
On this podcast?
Yes.
Okay, because I have a mouth like a sailor. I just swear constantly. Yeah, you could not get me to move back to New York, especially right now. All of our friends who are still there, they're like, oh, my landlord just raised my rent $700 per month, and there's literally nothing I can do about it. So yeah, I think I definitely prefer LA as a place, but New York for the people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice way of framing it.
Yeah.
But you're originally from Kansas? Is that where you?
No, I'm from Maine.
Maine.
But I'm from
Okay.
a very like small sort of rural part of Maine. So I definitely used that those experiences to think about this small Kansas town. Yeah, I wanted to set it in Kansas because it sort of seemed like it's in the smack dab middle of the country. It can be really representative of any small town in any state. So that's why I chose Kansas. I had originally wanted to set it in the South, but I have like no connection to the South whatsoever. And that's such like a textured, specific place that you really have to, know what you're talking about if you're going to set a book there. So I very quickly pivoted and was like, all right, we're going to do Kansas.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like it because then it also ties in with the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah,
Which I
yeah.
guess some of these characters would probably feel that way about, say, LA or New York, where some of our characters are from. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I know, so for those who watch our video version, I'm holding the book up right now, the North American edition, but I always like to analyze your UK edition because it does not have um, the trophy prize of the animal. It actually has this sign, Big Burr. And I'm assuming
Yeah.
that's because of cultural differences in the UK of hunting, like not knowing what that would
Well,
really represent. Yeah.
it's also very normal to give books different covers for different, countries or territories where they're published. So, yeah, I think part of it was probably, wanting the UK audience to understand sort of the setting of this book. And I think it's also a bit of a more commercial publisher that I'm published with in the UK. So I think they wanted a much more straightforward cover, you know? But yeah, it's really common to have different covers for, a US book versus a UK book.
and I do love how like simple this cover is. Like I
Mhm.
love the peachy pink, almost like has a brown
Millennial
undertone,
pink.
like ombre. Like, yes, I love it. And
Yeah.
then the kiddos I watch, they were, because they're vegetarian and like love animals and are like, no hunting. But they saw that and they were like, what's wrong with the deer, Miss Mary? What's wrong? And I was like, the deer is fine. Turn the book over if you can't look at it. But for me,
The deer is dead and gay.
exactly. But in my mind, like when I see that, I go, okay, so someone here is a hunter, which makes me think this is somewhere southern, somewhere, out in the Midwest where, this happens. But then you have the rainbow flag bow right underneath, which we already know that this particular mount, this deer and the bow, are already fixture in the last chapter. But as just looking at it with fresh eyes before you even looking at it, you can kind of already tell that this is a story about a queer community in a sort of like rural, very conservative type of town. And that's, again, like I said, that's just looking at the deer with the bow tie.
Right.
But again, it's simple and I love that. Like there's no more explanation and it doesn't give too much of the story away, I don't think.
Yeah. No, it's funny because when I first saw that cover, I had like just an initial gut reaction against the rainbow bow tie. I was like, that's homophobic. To like put a rainbow bow tie on it to sort of just like telegraph to everyone that this is a queer book or something. I don't know. There was something that I just like chafed against about it. But then they like changed the color to a plain black one or like something else. And it just didn't pop the same way. And eventually I really came around to the fact that like, yeah, I probably do want people to like pick up on the rainbow bow tie and know that this is like a queer book. And yeah, eventually I was very happy with the cover, but yeah, it took us a number of tries to get to where we ended up.
Yeah. Well, and also the antlers are a rainbow arc. Well, but upside down, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
again, you're like, it's symbolically showing that this is not somewhere going over. It's always constantly tension. There's tension in this community. And I like how the antlers show that tension. Especially because the
And
antlers
it's
cut through the name of Rainbow. Yeah.
right. And it's funny, my dad is a hunter and that's where I got all of this hunting stuff because it was like a really prominent part of my childhood. Like I remember we had a Halloween party one year in our neighborhood and it was during hunting season and he had a deer carcass hanging from the swing post and like all the kids were so grossed out and I was so embarrassed that like I was the kid with the dad who's got a fucking deer carcass hanging from the swing post. So yeah, that's where a lot of that came from. And my dad is like, the deer on this cover isn't the correct kind of deer, you know, that you would find in Kansas. You would only find that deer in like, I think he said like Australia or something. I can't remember, but he was like so upset that the deer wasn't correct. And I told my publisher, I was like, FYI, this is not like the kind of deer that you would find in Kansas. And they were like, yeah, we don't care. Like, it looks good. Like, this is the image that we have. This is the deer we're using.
But you tried to
So
give
like my dad,
the analysis at least.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh my god. Well, did you grow up by Stephen King's area of Maine? Is that Bangor where he lives?
Yeah, so that's a little bit north from where I lived. I was in Brunswick, which is like 40 minutes from Portland, if you've ever been to Portland in Maine, which is like a really cute little city. But, you know, I just was dying to get out of there growing up. I didn't know I was queer technically until I was 23. That's when I like had the realization, but I always knew that there was like some reason why I was dying to get out of Maine.
So, like, who in the novel, not that Celia, you're the replica of this certain character, because I don't like to go there with
Mm.
author affiliation with a character, but I'm sure, like, crafting each of your characters, is there a certain character you really saw your own coming out experience, your own journey that you felt for
Hmm.
the most out of everyone you crafted?
I don't think there was a character that like mirrored my coming out journey specifically, but probably personality wise, the character that I'm closest to is Tegan, you know, because she's just like, fuck this place, fuck these people. I can't stand it here. Like, I don't know why I signed up for this. And it's sort of funny because I was the one who came up with the idea for this book, you know. So I think people tend to think that I must be a very like, let's join hands and all come together type of person, you know, but I'm actually not that way at all. Especially over the years, as I've gotten older, I've especially become not that way at all. Um, so yeah, a lot of people are like, oh, you know, would you go to a task force that was doing something like this? And I'm like, hell no. You know, I think it would be hell on earth for me. Um, so yeah, it's just a really funny sort of contradiction that I came up with the idea for this book that might make you think that, you know, I'm more politically like, let's all get along than I am.
Yeah. Which I have to say, reading this book, there were definitely quite a few characters. Not quite a few. There's one in particular, Christine.
Mm.
She just made me cringe. Like, and every time I was reading her, I was like, oh. And I just want to know. I mean, as someone who writes themselves and has created characters I don't particularly like, there's always one thing where I'm like, okay, like I kind of agree with you. But what was your process writing some of these more conservative characters, these more closed-minded characters who, I mean, in my opinion, I was like, I just want to punch you all in the face.
Yeah, well, my process for Christine was, you know, had to really start thinking about where homophobia actually comes from, you know, so I did all this research and read a bunch of studies, and I found this one study that said that a lot of the roots of homophobia for certain people, it's jealousy, that we as queer people are able to subvert a lot of these societal expectations, like, you know, buying a house, having kids, getting married, and, you know, all of these steps that you're just assumed that you'll take, you know. So that was really literally the only way that I could understand homophobia, is because, like, yeah, I get if you're jealous, because being queer is the absolute best. So like, that's the only way that it made sense to me. So I was like, yeah, I think Christine feels really stifled by, you know, these strictures on her life, and she's really jealous that she doesn't get to live a little differently. So yeah, that was my way in for Christine. And then someone like Henry, I just, I had this friend growing up, and her mom came out as a lesbian when we were in high school. and then she came out while she was in college, and then her sister also like came out, I think sometime during or after college. And so it's, you know, this family with these three queer women in it. And I just always wondered like what their father in that situation must have felt like. So he was sort of my inspiration for the character of Henry, is, you know, just this small town guy who like thinks he's living this pretty normative life, and then all of a sudden is like, whoa, maybe things are not what they seem. um so yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
do have a bone to pick with you a little bit. Sorry, Andrew.
Mm,
Um, you the cat, Harley's cat. Why
mm.
did Harley's cat have to die? Sorry, I'm spoiling this, but we should already know.
Well,
Spoiler.
you know, looking back on the book from where I am now, there are certain things that I regret and am even like a little embarrassed about in terms of like the choices. Ooh, sorry about that. I'll turn this off. In terms of the choices I made in the book, like looking back, it's probably super uncool that I had like the genderqueer character in the book suffer one of the worst forms of violence that happens in the book. You know, so like if I was going to write this book again, I would not do that. I would have someone else's cat die, you know, or I wouldn't have a cat die at all. But I remember there were a certain number of characters that I already had in my head when I started writing the book, and I was just sort of going along and ticking them off. But then there was definitely a point where I was like, okay, who else is a character? And, you know, I had to figure out who these other people were and what was happening to them. So I went and read a lot of personal essays to sort of find inspiration for a lot of these characters. And I read just this absolutely gutting personal essay about this woman whose dogs were lost at the same time that she was like going through a terrible miscarriage. And she found out, like, I think it was like almost a year later or something, that her neighbor had killed her dogs. And it was just like, it was that piece stayed with me for a really long time. I think the first name of the woman who wrote it was Penny something. But anyway, that essay just really like tore me up. And it just got me thinking about how one of the worst things that a person could do to you is kill your pet, you know, or like in it, one step removed from kill your pet, you know, like take them to a shelter and, you know that they're probably going to be euthanized there. So I guess when I was thinking about, you know, what is one of the worst things that the townspeople could do to someone from this task force, that personal essay really stuck with me for that reason. And like I said, if I were writing this book again, I would have that happen to a different character, because, you know, someone who is genderqueer, they're already dealing with enough terrible things. I really don't think I should have put that on that character. But, you know, your education and your awareness and like all this stuff changes so much year by year, especially within the queer community, you know, because so much changes even within like the way we speak about things, the way we think about things. So I think especially when you're writing a queer book, you just have to know that like certain parts of it are going to appear very different when you look at it after a lot of time has gone by.
yeah. And a lot of my students had said, like, very glowingly, and I agree, that you really look into all the nuances of LGBTQ plus life, but it's not like you're doing it in a way that's didactic or um, just painting this brush of like just trying to include every color in the rainbow just because you feel you have to. So, how did you go into that process of I'm going to have a multidimensional nature of LGBTQ plus characters, but I don't want it to
Mm,
come across like I'm just trying to fit, you know, every ingredient into this novel.
right. That's really nice to hear that your students didn't think that it came across as didactic, because that's another one of those things that, like, I think even not with distance from the book, I was worried that certain parts came across as didactic. And I think especially with distance from the book, I'm like, yeah, there are certain parts that are really didactic. And I think that's honestly one of my biggest flaws as a writer in general, is that I'm kind of a didactic person, and I'm kind of like, that's how I write a lot of the time. That's it, at least where my initial inspiration comes from, is from some, it's from some like didactic place of like, this is what I think, and I want you to agree with me. So I'm going to write this book for that purpose, which is like not how I would really like to approach writing books, but it's just how I keep finding myself coming up with ideas for them. Um, so anyway, it's nice that your students don't feel that it was didactic, but I feel that certain parts definitely are. And then when it comes to like all of the characters, that represent, the full spectrum of being LGBTQ, I would say that came pretty naturally, because just for myself, a lot of my friends represent all of those different letters of the community. And, I think when so many people who, are bi or are like genderqueer or trans, it's a lot easier to feel like you can naturally inhabit that viewpoint, or that you can credibly create a character like that. So yeah, I never was going along thinking, oh well, I have to create a bi character because that's the B. It was just like, it felt very natural to create these characters because I think a lot of us in the queer community, it's just natural that a lot of people that are representing those different spectrums.
Yeah. And a lot of discussion that I've been absorbed by, whether it be with my students, whether it be how I approached, especially um, the musical The Prom and their whole agenda, these Broadway performers to go into a small town in Indiana and have, you know, the lesbian high schooler have her prom with her girlfriend, and they're, coming with blinders though, because they're going in with the intention of being woke and progressive for
Mm,
publicity's sake. So
mm,
you really start to peel back the layers of, not everyone has good intention when they're
mm,
activists.
mm-hmm,
How do they learn from the small town community and vice? They're both sharing
mm-hmm,
perspectives, and that's like where I see the through line between the musical and your novel, um, because they are two separate works. But I do think you also really do show that a small town is not without its lessons to teach
mm-hmm,
acceptance across America,
mm-hmm,
and that we shouldn't be pitting states against each other. And I think that's something I really wanted to talk about in this interview, because right now we have the Don't Say
mm,
Gay bill in
mm-hmm,
Florida. We keep seeing LGBTQ plus books trying to be banned, like including those we've interviewed, like Lev Rosen's Camp comes to my
mm-hmm,
mind. So, but again, there's also a lot of LGBTQ plus and progressive groups fighting in those states. So it's not like
mm-hmm,
the whole state is a wash,
right,
and it's not like the Northeast does not have homophobia, because it does.
right,
Um, New York City has homophobia. I mean,
mm-hmm,
um, so like, how do you feel your novel resonates, especially
mm,
right now with all of those
mm.
um, political elements? Okay, hold on to that question because we'll be right back. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a tendency among queer people who live in, bigger metropolitan areas and coastal areas like, New York and LA, for example, to write off these states, where there are a lot more conservative people. But the reality is that queer people live in those states. They are there. So we can't just write them off, like we have to try and fight these things. And it's funny that you mentioned Under the Rainbow similarity with the prom, because a lot of people brought that up. And then there was this other book that was published, I think maybe like a year before Under the Rainbow, called Real Queer America. And it was a nonfiction book about, how there are just a lot of queer people sprinkled throughout the United States, and all of these states where you maybe necessarily wouldn't expect to find them. And a lot of people mentioned the similarity between Real Queer America and my book, sort of being like the fictionalized version of Real Queer America. So yeah, I think it's always important to remember that you can't just write a whole state off, and you have to remember that there are queer people there being affected by these things.
Yeah, yeah. And representation matters with your novel, especially. Like, that's why I think it's so important that, such a large readership has read Under the Rainbow, who wouldn't encounter...
Oh, is it large, would you say?
I think
it's
so.
Large?
Yes.
In my mind, there's like a very tiny little swath of the population that's read the book. And I think my sales would probably also reflect that. But it's nice that you think that a large portion of people have read the book.
Well, and the way just even teaching it, like I think encouraging more educators, so calling all the educators out there in high school and college, it's such a wonderful text to teach because of the vignette style, of the different first person psyches, because they are so different, but also that it's not like everything is solved. Like, there is no, fairy tale ending. Like, okay, those who might have had some homophobia have learned their lesson, and now they're going to join Acceptance Across America. Like, what was that campaign? Because I brought it up in class. Did you draw any inspiration from the Hands Across America?
No, there was actually an actual group through the HRC. I think it was called Project One America. And I only found out about it after I came up with the idea for the novel, and I was trying to think about logistically how this would actually work, like sending a task force into a homophobic state or region. And that was literally what the HRC did with Project One America. They sent a task force into, I think it was like 3 different southern states. I can't remember which one specifically. And their purpose was to try to like expand LGBTQ equality in these places. And I wish that I had been like a little further along in my career, or just a little bit braver at the point that I was researching it, because at that point I wasn't actually a published novelist. I was just writing the book and hoping that one day it would be published. So I felt like if I reached out to anyone from that group, that they wouldn't take me very seriously, but I was dying to speak to these people who had been in this task force to find out, what kinds of things they were actually doing, what kind of experiences they had. But I didn't feel that I could. So that's when I just, used my imagination and tried to guess what kinds of things they were doing, and, how certain situations would have played out.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and the audiobook, because I cannot leave this interview without talking about it, is so masterful. One of the best audiobooks I've ever heard.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes, the performers are incredible. Soon after your interview is released, I'm releasing the interview with Michael Crouch, who I had the pleasure to talk about.
I saw that you interviewed him. That's so amazing.
Yeah, he was wonderful. And he loved his experience, he said, with Under the Rainbow. And
good.
I just, for all of you out there, is a full cast. Every vignette is a different actor. I love
Mm-hmm.
this almost radio style performance. Um,
Mm.
it takes me back to when that used to happen. Um, in like the 1940s. I wasn't alive, but we've heard of what happened. But when you all would just tune in and there would be a full performance of a
Mm-hmm.
novel. So I've thought a lot about how your novel would be turned into a mini series for TV, just because I think it's
Mm.
really powerful as a mini series. I'm not sure Mary too. I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
see it as a mini series.
No,
That's
I
how I
agree.
see it
Mm-hmm.
too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So is that something you've been in talks with? Is, you know,
Yeah, that we've sold the option for that to happen, and I don't know if you guys know what that means, but it basically means that for 1 year, this certain company, I'm not sure if I'm like allowed to say, so I won't probably say who it is, but there's this one company that has the option to turn this into a TV show or a movie technically, but I think TV show is where we're going. So they're going to like go around and pitch it and see if we can get anyone to agree to actually make it. But it's very common with writers that you'll sell the option and then it will expire and nothing will have come from it. So I try not to get very attached to the idea that the show will actually be made, but we've taken the very first step for that to happen. So it would be really exciting if that did happen. But yeah, and I remember you had mentioned in your email asking about like my involvement with the audiobook, and that
mhm.
was actually really amazing because I was quite involved with choosing all of the voice actors for the book. They were very open to like my suggestions because obviously I had an idea of how all of these people were going to sound when I was writing them. So when they would send through a suggestion for a certain character, I'm like, oh no, I pictured like a much deeper voice, more gravelly, whatever. And I would just sort of go poke around on Audible and see if I could find, something that was closer to what I was thinking about. So it was like very, very collaborative and really fun, to be able to, put a literal voice to these voices that I had had in my head.
Yeah. So you've listened to your audiobook.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's
I'm
actually
not sure.
surprising.
I'm
Most
not
of
sure if I've
those.
listened to it the
Oh,
whole way through because
okay.
you reach a point of fatigue,
Mm,
of like reading your own book and hearing your own book, and especially like I was editing Under the Rainbow for 3 entire years with my editor. So that was even after I sold the book, we were editing it for 3 years. So I was especially at like a point of fatigue with the book, but I definitely like went through each story and at least listened to like the first couple pages that the narrator had read. But I was really, really pleased with how close we were able to get with each character to what I had envisioned. I think everyone did such a wonderful job.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I just think it's wonderful that you actually like listen to samples from other actors on Audible because yeah, it's just been such a range. I mean, Mary and I like we always ask this just because I usually try to listen to the audiobook just so I can have that experience away from Mary's reading of it and we can bring
Mm,
that up because yeah, some authors choose like some authors want to choose the actor and then others want more of a hands off like they trust the director or it's not
mm.
always that collaborative
Well, I'm a
experience.
control freak, so
Oh.
anytime anyone gives me the option to take control, I'm like, yes, I would love that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, did you actually
And I
fit?
couldn't
No, I was just gonna
I
say.
couldn't
Go
give
ahead.
them any direction.
Okay.
So like I was able to choose the people that I wanted for the most part, but then when it was time for them to actually read the book, I didn't get to weigh in at that point. So what I did was I just gave notes about each character, the way that I hoped the tone would come across, um, And I mean, they nailed it based on that. So yeah, I wasn't able to be that involved with like sitting there and giving them direction. But that's probably better, honestly, you know?
Well, yeah, I think unless I've only seen it in the case when an author has a performing background and they
Mm-hmm.
actually want to direct their audiobook.
Mm-hmm. Or a
Or
lot of
they,
authors read their own
yeah,
audiobook
I
if
was
you're
going to say
like
that.
well known enough. Yeah,
You
they
didn't,
want you to do it.
you didn't want to be Avery or like one of the characters.
I mean, that wasn't presented as an option to me, but if it was, I definitely would have declined, because I just feel like a voice actor could do such a better job than me. I don't think I would ever prefer to do one of my own audio books.
Huh, okay. So
Yeah,
you
I'm
don't
just
see
not
yourself
like,
reading your audiobook.
no, I'm definitely not of a like performative enough reader or person, to do that. Like, I remember I did a reading recently with a group of people, and there was this one woman who, like, she did her own reading in such like a lovely performative way that I was like so impressed. And I was just like, I have no idea how you did that and how I could ever get to a place of being even close to that. So I'll
Hmm.
leave it to the experts.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I know Mary really wanted to ask about like the hardest things to write in your
Mm.
novel. So I'm gonna give the floor to you, Mary, for that
Yeah, no, I
segue.
mean, obviously we've talked about the different points of view and things like that in that are happening in this story. Who was the hardest to write?
I mean, it's a pretty obvious, like, if you had to guess, would you say Christine?
Of course.
Yeah, that was definitely the hardest for sure. And like I said, the way that I conquered that was just to imagine she was really jealous. And that's how I got through writing that story. And also to sort of like put humor in there in a way where like Christine herself is not a funny person, but like, when she goes to throw the plate on the floor and it's like laminate that like doesn't allow the plate to crack, it's like you can laugh in that moment, maybe a little bit at her, maybe a little bit with her, but like, finding those moments of humor even within a character that doesn't have a sense of humor. So I would say that's another way that I like found a way in.
Yeah, yeah. Or even like when I just love the 10 years later,
Mm-hmm.
um, when she goes to the first ever, um, well, gay owned because it's Gabe and Brad spoiling some things, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to get too deep into what happens with them. But she goes
Yeah.
to the coffee shop, and it's like her support for the queer community is she's going to buy coffee, but then complain about the price and how long it's taking for a pour over. Like, it is kind of hilarious and comedic in that way that,
Mm-hmm.
she's trying and you kind of want to give her
Oh, and see, in
credit
my mind, she just goes because the coffee is actually good,
because she likes
you
the
know,
coffee. Yeah.
because she likes the coffee. And like, that was one thing that really stood out to me, is that I actually took a trip to a small Kansas town as research for this book while I was writing it. And the coffee was so goddamn terrible in every single place in this town. It was just like an atrocity, So I really think, and it was a question that like my wife and I had while we were there, of like, do these people not know what good coffee tastes like, or do they just not care? Or like, what is the thing that is making the coffee so bad? Because you don't have to have expensive beans to like make a better cup of coffee. So in my head, it was just like a lot of people from Big Burr would eventually learn to appreciate good coffee if it was available to them.
Yeah. It's funny. Um, and I really like that, you focus a lot on that element of like I know we're using Christine, but there's also I'm trying to remember his name, but the son who like has homophobic
Oh,
Billy?
gestures.
Gabe's son?
Billy, yes,
Billy,
thank you,
yeah.
Gabe. Yeah, Gabe's son Billy, who like is the ringleader of
Mm-hmm.
um harassing Avery's mother and
Mm-hmm.
anyone who is in the Acceptance Across America task force, like
Mm-hmm.
with gestures. But then eventually you do start to understand the psyche behind why he didn't feel accepted by his father. So, like, I just think it's so important that you include that they're not a caricature, right? And I think
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
they're not just a homophobic person who doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have, like you're saying, there's a root for any kind of intolerance. And,
Mm-hmm.
that's something in your novel that is such a powerful takeaway is
Mm-hmm.
find the root. Like, understand that people, um, it's hard to deny someone's existence when they're in front of you. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that's what Acceptance Across America really teaches this community is, are you not going to talk to the people because they are in Acceptance Across America and they're LGBTQ plus? Um, there's a
Mm-hmm.
kind of assimilation that starts to happen, which I think is interesting.
Well, I have Avery make the joke in that first chapter that it sort of reminds her of the real world, but like we literally watch that happen a lot of the time on the real world where like there are these people on the show who are like, I hate gay people. And then they get put in a house with a gay person and turns out they like them quite a bit, and they like find some way to get along or they don't, but like I did think about like the real world about these strangers put in this house and how a lot of the time what happened is that they would learn that they didn't actually hate gay people.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and if I can, Mary,
Hmm.
turn to my student corner.
Yes,
I would
please.
love that. I'm
Okay.
so
Okay.
curious
I know,
And
so am I.
if
I
we
haven't
can
seen
go
because
it.
like,
I think about
yeah.
teaching this to the students that I had in my MFA program at the University of New Mexico, and they were actually quite conservative. A lot of my students, like, I think they would have hated this
Oh,
book.
interesting.
So yeah, I'm really curious to hear what your students
Yeah.
thought.
Well, I definitely have very open-minded students,
Mm,
especially, in this self-selecting
yes.
English department, like on
Yeah.
Long Island, close to New York City. But again, I mean, I'm
Mm,
sure um, there's always gonna be pushback, right?
yeah.
Unfortunately, but yeah, I'll read through a few of the questions, and if it's okay to like go an extra like 10 minutes with you,
Oh,
is that
totally.
okay? Like
Yeah.
past our 6 o'clock time. Okay.
No, that's fine.
Okay. So, and of course, Mary, if you want to riff too, when I'm
I
going
just want to
through
hear these
these.
questions.
But okay, so Brianna asks, were any of the characters from your book based on someone you knew personally?
People love to ask that. And I think that they're hoping that there will be an answer of yes, But honestly, I mean, I guess I did mention that I had that friend that I grew up with, and, her dad was suddenly like, surrounded by these three queer women in his family. And so he was like very removed an inspiration for Henry. Um, but I can't say that any character was very typically based on anyone that I knew. I was really creating a lot of these people, sort of starting from an archetype and then trying to make them more specific.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, there will be little things here and there, especially that like my parents, when they read the book, would notice certain things of like, oh, that's from your real life, that's from your real life, or like that's someone we know, but it would be just these tiny little glimpses. So yeah, a character as a whole was not based on anyone.
yeah. Okay. My student Lizzie is a big Taylor Swift fan, so she saw
Oh, me
that
too.
you are.
Obsessed.
Yeah, she's
Obsessed.
like I read in Celia's bio that she is a huge Taylor Swift fan and likes dissecting Taylor Swift lyrics. So She wants to know if you got any inspiration from Taylor Swift songs to write certain
Oh,
vignettes.
well, listen, I think that in my future, like writing a novel based on a Taylor Swift song would be like a really cool thing to do. And I really felt like the albums that Taylor put out during the pandemic, like Folklore, to me, they really felt like novels and stories, you know, because she even had like the love triangle going on in Folklore with like Betty and the song August. Like those are all
Mm,
like the same three people. She talked a lot about you know, that she had these like recurring characters basically coming up in her songs on Folklore. um, so I would absolutely love to write something fictional based on a Taylor Swift song someday, but I didn't do that for Under the Rainbow. And
okay.
you know, just while we're on the topic of Taylor Swift, like I really think she's queer. And you know, like when I dissect those lyrics, you better believe it's because I'm looking for that queer bait that's been in there, and I can find it a lot of places. So just, you know, if anyone ever wants to talk to me about like Taylor Swift being queer and that being reflected in her lyrics, then you know, get at me. We'll talk about it for hours.
Yeah. 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 Oh, yeah. You could do a whole seminar on Taylor Swift
Right.
and
Oh, absolutely.
like hidden
Yeah.
coding and oh,
Hmm.
yeah.
Like the song Dress, it cannot be about a man. It just cannot, you know?
Mm. There we go. Okay, so everyone out there, look at dress, listen to it. We need to
Yeah.
dissect it. Okay, so this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
something that keeps coming up anytime I teach your novel is
Mm.
they want my students want you to confirm is PB Tall Guy who is on the app the actual man who is at the motel who is part
Ah.
of that
Yeah,
like
I wanna know.
dominant hate
Mm.
crime
Mm.
blurry boundary just really awful experience
Yeah.
that happens.
In my mind, the man at the motel was not PB Tall Guy.
Huh. Okay.
It was just like a stranger, and it's sort of a happenstance thing that, you know, this occurs. But
Interesting.
I wanted to leave it sort of murky, you know,
Yeah.
in the book.
Yeah. Because I thought it was PB Tall Guy, and he was like that was
He had
his.
been baiting.
Yeah, like he was
Yeah.
baiting him to like take out his own internalized homophobia about
Mm.
himself.
Hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, I wanted to leave that as an option that people could have guessed about, but in my own mind, I saw this guy at the motel as just someone completely different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking, Mary, you should contribute to asking the questions too, even though you didn't have these students. You
Just
can
say they. No, I don't know any of
read the
these people.
questions. But I was gonna say, if you want to read Justin's question, if you have that in front of you.
Sure. So
Okay.
Justin from Andrew's class asks, were there any ways that you wanted to subvert the conservative views on the LGBTQ plus community that you couldn't explore in the book?
Well, I would say the stories where I did try to sort of subvert what you would guess for a conservative character would be Linda and Elsie, because, you know, Linda basically starts to feel like an outsider in her own town due to her grief. So that's her way of like connecting with these task force members is, you know, they're outsiders and she all of a sudden started to feel like an outsider. And then with Elsie, you know, I was like, well, what if, you know, one of the oldest people in Big Burr, who you would think would be really close minded, is actually one of the few people that's like open to using they, them pronouns and, you know, like better at a lot of this stuff than, you know, someone that you might think would be really good at it. And, you know, Harley and Elsie have this connection based on, you know, mothers and motherhood. So yeah, I would say that those moments of connection between characters is how I tried to subvert you know, the conservative viewpoints and what you might expect from these characters.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so Joshua asks, did you have any alternate endings
Mm,
in mind for your narrative?
that's a great question. The book I had many, many different endings. I think the first ending that I had for the book was Elsie's story, and we just sort of end there, and it's all sort of, a little up in the air. It's more of like an open-ended ending. And then my second ending was Zach's story, and we just leave with him. We end with him just getting the fuck out of Big Burr, and that was sort of like a message that I was thinking about conveying at the time, is like, if you would like to get out of these places, you should, and you can, but also there are people who want to stay, and, like they should and they can. So yeah, I think the ending that we finally landed on, like I said, it was very late in the editing process, and it was because my team really wanted a much more sort of wrapped up feeling, and maybe like wrapped up with a bow on it even, they really wanted like this sense of closure and characters coming back together. So yeah, that's when I went back to Olive Kittredge and, came up with this idea of Gabe falling in love. And that's how I finally wrapped it up. Yeah, there were many different endings along the way.
Great. Yeah. I'm telling you, you're like, it's wonderful when you have the author here to answer all the questions, which is why I keep saying to teachers out there, assign these podcast episodes and I can try to get these questions to the authors, because I love like having the, like showing that there isn't much distance between author and reader. And yeah, so thank you, Celia, for entertaining I'm learning so much just from you exploring this. And I know my students are so happy hearing this. Okay, so Mary's going to ask a question from Emma R. I love this. This is like a radio show. We have callers.
Right?
Emma R.
Yes.
So Emma R, she's got a two-parter question here. So she says, firstly, what kind of research did you have to do for the novel? Did you get firsthand experience and actually travel to a town like Big Burr and speak to the people who lived there?
Yeah, so I touched on that, a little bit earlier, that I did, while I was in my MFA program, I applied for a grant to, drive over and do this, because, I wasn't about to pay my own money to go stay in some crappy little Kansas town. And yeah, my wife and I drove over there, and we like stayed in a hotel for, I think we were supposed to stay originally for 3 nights. And after the second night, we were just like, we can't stay here for one more night. And we just left early. But yeah, this is actually really funny. The name of the town is called Liberal, and, like LOL, it is not a liberal place, so that's pretty oxymoronic that, that's where we went. But my dissertation advisor had recommended it to me as like a place to check out, because he did a lot of driving back and forth across the country. And it was apparently a town that he drove through all the time. And he was like, yeah, it seems like kind of the vibe you're going for Big Burr. So that's how I chose it. And like I said, it was definitely a very eye-opening experience, because I think I was expecting to find some amount of like cute small town culture, like maybe there would be like the bakery that like this, wonderful woman makes all this nice homemade bread, and like, this or that. And honestly, there was just zero, to me, there was zero, like amount of nice or good things in this town. Like we literally drove an hour to a Target to get coffee that was potable. like there was just nothing to me redeeming about this town. And it was just so incredibly bleak. Like the best meal we had was at an Applebee's. And like you realize while you're there that this is the reason that chains like this exist, is because for some people it is actually the best meal they can find in their town. Like we went to like a little independently owned Italian place, and it was some of the worst food I've ever had in my life. Like just like everything was bad and terrible. Wow. So yeah, it was actually like a struggle to find those redeeming things about fictional Big Burr, because the actual town that we had been to was so bleak.
Okay, a lot of my students, the Emmas, ask about autobiographical elements, and you've touched on that about,
Mhm.
but
Yes.
they were very, very fascinated. So you've answered anything that has to do with whether characters are related to you, if you knew anyone like them. Um, but I really want Mary to ask Emily's question.
Mm. So Emily asked, do you see Under the Rainbow being taught at the secondary level? If a high school teacher were to teach your book, how would you hope they would teach it?
I mean, I think that would be wonderful if a high school teacher wanted to teach this book. I would hope that the teacher had the knowledge that they needed, to teach it, because, you don't just want some like cishet person teaching this book and, misinterpreting a bunch of different things. But I would assume that if someone was going to teach this book, it would be because they had some amount of connection to it or, familiarity with it. But yeah, I mean, I wish I could have read something like this in high school. Like my whole life would have been changed if I could have read something like this in high school. And honestly, it's a lot of the reason why I wrote this book is because books like this just did not exist when I was younger. So, yeah, that would be awesome. I hope people tell me about it if they do.
Yeah. Okay, so I have two more questions.
No
We're
worries.
wrapping this up. Well, one person is in the audience, so I'm gonna wait for her question. And she's actually gonna deliver it. It's a surprise.
Great.
It's a surprise for the audience, not for us. Um, so Gabriella asked a question that I actually really want to have been thinking about every time I pick up your book, which is what would have happened, she asked, if you had actually chose a town that had been
Mm.
ranked the most homophobic town in America and it wasn't a fictional town. Like, did you think about that?
I think I would be murdered right now. I think I would not be
Mm.
on this podcast existing right now. Like literally. Yeah. Um, yeah. I think it was very important that this town was fictional. And honestly, I was even scared to choose a real state to set it in. Like there are people who were really upset that I was portraying Kansas this way, even though Kansas does have a lot of very queerphobic laws on the record, Um, but yeah, there were a lot of people who were very upset that, I chose to set it in Kansas. So, and I'm actually quite lucky in that I didn't receive nearly the amount of like hate and like trolls that I thought I might for writing a book like this. But yeah, I think if I had set this in an actual, real, very homophobic place, I would be murdered.
Wow.
Like, I mean, authors go through this a lot, and I know of it happening personally to a lot of people, and it's really, really scary when it does happen. So, anything you can do to mitigate that, you do.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and we want you to be safe, Celia.
Yes.
I'm glad you're here. Please. I don't want you to go anywhere or any author to go anywhere.
I mean, we'll see how people feel after this next book that I've written, where I basically take a giant shit on the wedding industry. Like maybe people are going to want to murder me then. So there's always something that people can find to strongly disagree with in your
Yeah.
books.
Yeah, and we'll definitely end on so happy for you so you can pitch it to everyone because
Oh,
I
sure.
can't wait to get it. Okay, so Nicole Arguello, who is one of our interns, asked you a really exciting question, but Nicole, I want you to deliver it, please, to Celia since you're here. So Nicole, the floor is yours. Please um, ask away your question.
Hi. So my question was, what made you choose to write this novel through the perspective of multiple characters rather than focusing solely on one perspective? And if you were to choose to elaborate on only one character's story, whose would it be?
Mm.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I would say that the reason that I chose, to highlight multiple characters is I had mentioned this a little bit earlier, that short stories were literally all I knew how to write at the time that I started writing this book. So I didn't think that I would be able to know how to write a book from just one person's perspective for like 250 whole pages. So it was honestly kind of like a technical reason for why, I wrote the book this way. And honestly, after having written now like a couple more books that are just much more straightforward novels with one main character, it's a hell of a lot easier to do that than to write a novel with 11 different characters that all have to intersect in some way. Like, I thought that I was doing something that was easier, but I was actually doing something that was harder. So yeah, that bit me in the butt, that choice.
Yeah, to remember all the characters. I just think, wow, to remember, like, they each have to interact at some point or know each other somehow in this town.
And that was like what my team was really pushing, was like more interaction between all these characters. And like every time I would go into one story and change one little thing, it was like a ripple effect that like changed all these other things in these other stories. It was like, honestly, when you're playing the game Jenga, with all those like different wooden blocks, it was like you pull out one wooden block and then you've screwed everything else and it's going to come tumbling down. So like there was really a point of insanity that I reached a lot of times about trying to keep all of these different timelines straight and all of these different characters straight, because you pull at one thing and everything else falls apart. So yeah.
Oh, and one character, Nicole asked, if you had to expand on one, would there have been one you would have expanded?
Well, I think I kind of made that choice by having the last story circle back with Gabe, because they really did want, that final story that wrapped things up. And I thought about who I could return to and have, more to show for them. And it was Gabe. I mean, a lot of people have asked me if I would write a sequel to the book so that we get to see like what's happened to all the characters, at some point in the future. And, that would probably be a fun and wild thing to do at some point. Like Jennifer Egan just released this book, The Candy House, which is revisiting a lot of her characters from A Visit from the Goon Squad, which is actually a book that also was very helpful for me. And I forgot to mention at the beginning of this interview, but Jennifer Egan just did it. So, it's definitely something I could try at some point. So, well, if it ever seems like enough people want it, then maybe I'll do it.
I think you should. And then maybe Gabe would be your, it seems like Gabe could be like the character who takes us through. Like if there is one, like protagonist who would be the first person voice, I could see Gabe, but okay. So Celia, we can't leave without you telling all of the listeners and those watching, how can they, they can go to any bookstore or online, an independent site, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, but so happy for you. How would you describe it for all of us?
Okay, let me see if I can remember my elevator pitch. It is about Robin, who's a queer academic and loathes weddings, but then her best friend from childhood, Ellie, gets engaged and asks her to be the maid of honor for the wedding. And Robin very reluctantly agrees. And basically after that, Robin starts to see that Ellie is a bride who would kill for the perfect wedding, maybe even literally. So it's sort of like a thriller, dark comedy, satire situation that's really, really different from Under the Rainbow. So it'll be very interesting to see if people who liked Under the Rainbow will also like So Happy for You, because it's just like such a different vibe.
Yeah, well, I can't wait. And the audiobook, I'm sure you've, had your hand in figuring it out. So
Oh yeah, well, there was just one person to choose for this
Oh,
one,
there we
so
go.
it wasn't like quite as exciting, but I definitely knew the person that I wanted, and we got her, and I think she's going to do a fantastic job. I think I can probably tell you that it was the person who voiced Tegan.
Oh, wonderful.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I know they're
yeah.
not done or anything, but that's who it's supposed to be.
Yeah. And the release date, when is it coming out?
It comes
so
out June 7th
June
this
7th.
year.
Okay,
Mhm.
June 7th.
Good.
Soon.
Yeah.
So just a
Pride
month
month.
away.
Mm-hmm.
A month. Okay.
Yeah, just a little over a month. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great. Celia, you are more than welcome. Please come back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
Oh yeah, anytime. Just let me know.
Well, we'll have to talk about So Happy for You. I know you're going to be in a lot of, whirlwind of publicity. Hopefully. I hope it's a
I
whirlwind.
mean, hopefully, but you know,
Well,
you never know.
you can come talk to us because we have a special book corner feature. Once everyone
Ooh.
has met the author, we bring them back on if it's about a new book that they've released. So we're ready to deep dive So Happy for You. Maybe we can do it in the fall. It could be a nice,
Yeah.
like getting ready for Halloween kind of feel with
Yeah.
murderous
Dun, dun,
weddings.
dun.
Well, thank you so much, Celia. And
Thank you.
Mary
you.
had so much fun here.
Yes.
And Nicole's surprise appearance. It was great. Thank you
Yeah,
so much. And
this is a total pleasure. Thank you
Yes,
so much
yes.
for reading the book so closely and asking such great questions, and teaching it to your students. That's just all so lovely. So thank you.
oh, well, and bye to everyone out there. Get your hands on Under the Rainbow
Yes.
and So Happy for You. Okay.
Yes.
Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed this Ivory Tower Boiler Room or True Crime in Academia episode. You can watch our video versions of our episodes on patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Join at the price of an iced coffee, or join as an Ivory Tower member and get some of our exclusive merchandise. I could not be here without an amazing team. So I'm Andrew Rimby, the executive director, and I am joined with Mary DePippi, our chief contributor, who hosts True Crime in Academia. It comes out on Tuesdays. Jaron Usta is our marketing director, and our two interns are Nicole Arguello and Kimberly Dallas. And I'm actually here with Mary. So Mary, where can they follow us on social media?
You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Ivory Tower Boiler Room. On Twitter, we are at Ivory Boiler Room. And then just search the Ivory Tower Boiler Room on Facebook and you can like our page there.
Wonderful. And we, Mary and I, and the whole team hope you all are healthy and happy. And we can't wait to join you and have you all join us in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.